All righty, let's get started. So, call the November 19th, 2020 Sammamish Planning Commission online edition to order. Let's start out with our meeting accessibility.
Thank you, Chair Boffman. Good evening, everyone. Pursuant to the Governor's Emergency Proclamation 20-25, the city is unable to provide an in-person location for the public to listen to the virtual Planning Commission meeting this evening. Meetings are still accessible to the public, and public comment is able to be submitted. To view live, you can visit the city website at www.sammamish.us/TV21 or on Comcast Channel 21, that's within Sammamish only. To view the meetings later, meeting videos are available usually the day after the meeting on the city website, also on the city YouTube channel and Comcast Channel 21. Thank you.
All righty, let's start out with roll call. I will try again like we did last time. I'll just read names. And if you would unmute and say here and maybe raise your hand. So for the video, if you have your camera on. So I'll start out with myself, Mark Boffman, present. Rituja Indipur.
Present.
Mike Bresco.
Present.
Josh Amato.
Present.
Larry Crandall.
Present.
Karthik Sitharaman.
Present.
Great, thank you, everybody. Next, approval of the agenda. Has anyone had any comments or questions, or does anyone have any reason not to approve this evening's agenda? Okay, then we'll call the agenda approved by common consent. Next would be approval of our last meeting's meeting minutes. So that would have been the November 5th meeting. If you had a chance to look at those, does anybody have any comments or corrections from the November 5th meeting minutes? Anyone object to approving those? Okay, we'll call the November 5th meeting minutes approved by common consent. Next is non-agenda public comment. Jackie, do we have anybody for non-agenda public comment?
We do not have anyone for non-agenda public comment. If we could just pause for one moment, we're having a little bit of sound issues again. If you could just give us one moment here.
Okay.
Thanks, sorry about that.
Sure. I feel like I should be obligated to have a time filler of some kind. I could probably tell dad jokes, but I don't think anybody would appreciate those.
There's certainly an audience for him.
Sounds like one of our systems was reconfigured, so they're having trouble getting the audio to the live stream. So they're going to try to see if they can resolve that quickly. Sorry about that, everyone. We do have two callers on the line for non-agenda public comment, so we hang tight, we do see you. We'll just try to get this resolved quickly.
Okay.
This is Kelly Hildy, Deputy Director. While we are waiting for the technical issues to resolve, I will just use this time to remind the Planning Commission that the December 3rd meeting has been canceled and that we will be back in session on December 17th for our public hearing on the wireless communication regulation update.
So Kelly, does that seem like the last time we'll be talking about the wireless code for a while?
Yes, fingers crossed. Absolutely. It is our holiday gift to you, Mark.
Nice try, Mark. It'll always come back.
I'm just dropping hints. All I want for Christmas. Everybody got their holiday lights put up already?
No.
We've definitely noticed in our neighborhood that with people spending more time at home, they have started early.
I noticed the same too. I thought everybody was just celebrating Diwali with all of us, so they were up a couple of weeks ago. So it's nice to see. You're right. I think probably people are getting ready earlier because they're home.
The problem is now I'm feeling pressured, like I have to get mine up early. So probably this weekend I better do that.
Mine will be going up after Thanksgiving, so.
Usually that's what I do, but I have a retired neighbor across the street who always makes it into a little bit of a competition. And if I'm too far behind him, then I get scolded. So I probably better get started with that.
Yeah, I can't do that because I will for sure lose. So I'll step back and let him win. We've got somebody down the other end of the road that does quite a bit. Definitely blows out all the other neighbors. So
Yeah. Well, what I try to do is I try to lure him into giving me a hard time because his wife almost inevitably then bakes some holiday cookies and brings them over. So there's a strategy to all this madness.
Hello?
Sorry, everyone. It looks like our the sound for the live stream might not be working for tonight. We are recording the meeting, so we will be able to upload it at a later date. But Chair Boffman, if you want to go ahead and proceed with the non-agenda public comment, let me know if you're ready.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do non-agenda public comment.
Okay, thank you. Our first caller, I will go ahead and unmute you. You will have 3 minutes to begin your public comment. Please begin by stating your name and where you live for the record.
Hi, this is Michael Barber Gelada, and I live in Sammamish right by Beaver Lake Park. And I just had a question because I moved over here from West Seattle around 3.5 years ago for my daughter so she could start school over here because we have such good schools. And I don't know if this is the right meeting or not, but I'm just concerned about me and a bunch of my friends, the home learning, because a lot of us are having problems with our kids now, kind of, playing games on the side because it's gotten old for them. So I don't know, like I said, if this is the right forum, but what can we do to try getting our kids back to school, at least on the part-time basis? That's my comment. I'm done.
So this is David Pyle, the Director of Community Development for the city. In response to your comments, it depends on which school district you're in. However, if you're in the Issaquah School District, you would want to provide comment to the Issaquah School Board. Likewise, the Lake Washington School District has school board meetings that are publicly advertised and are accessible. I myself have 4 kids at home that are online learning. I totally understand what you're going through. And unfortunately, the city is not in control of decisions made by the school district as to when they start school or close classrooms or end remote learning. So we're in the same boat as you, and I sympathize with you and apologize for that. My suggestion would be to direct your commentary to the school district, the applicable school district, depending on whether you're in Issaquah or Lake Washington District.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Jackie, I think you said we had 2.
Yes, we actually currently have 2 more waiting. So I will go ahead and unmute the second caller. You will have 3 minutes to provide your comment. Please begin by stating your name and your address for the record.
Good evening. This is Mary Wichter, and I live at 408 208th Avenue Northeast in Sammamish, Washington, and have been for the last 20 years. I do live in Tamarack, and I wanted to speak to the last meeting that the Planning Commission had on November 5th about the docket requests. It was a really good meeting with lots of discussion. I learned a lot listening to commissioner questions, and also David Pyle and other staff members who did a really excellent job with that. What I wanted to provide is a little bit of data with regard to numbers, because people were wondering how many things are affected. And I can tell you where I live, we started having problems in our area about 2004, and there were fairly large problems that happened in 2012, 2013. And the city of Sammamish went through 5 emergency surface stormwater management ordinances. They adopted new code in 2016. We got them to adopt more code in 2019. So there are some stormwater regulations that we worked on to help. But the problem is there's a lot of existing lots that were platted in 1889 from Englewood, and those are 25 feet by 100 feet, so they're 2,500 square feet. So they're about R17 sized lots in an R4 area, and there's 150 to 160 of those left vacant still. So there are problems happening in that area. And in Tamarack, there's 210 lots, 167 homes have been built, and that leaves 40 lots which are vacant, and there's 6 or 7 which are either currently under construction or trying to construct. So we are getting hit with a lot, and the problems in these areas is we have steep slopes that should be regulated as landslide hazard areas. We have landslide hazard areas. There is erosion hazard areas more in the Englewood area, a tiny bit in Tamarack, but the problem is we have people who are building, they get a lot, they see it's cheap, they try to do something, they don't have any skill or background and maybe even having done a house before, and they try. There's a lot of times a foreclosure, 2 foreclosures, or the projects just get stalled out. So it really is up to the city to identify critical areas and provide protection for them and make sure that the original build from a vacant lot or anything that's an expanded build or remodel, or even if the house burned down, that it would basically meet the existing codes as well as possible. And if that means you have to do enforcement, you have to do enforcement, because with enforcement you can actually assign fines and you can get the people paid for it. But the problem is when things are not regulated, there's nothing you can do. You can't even talk to the neighbor. You can't do a civil suit. You just end up with problems happening further down the hill. So anyway, I wanted to let you know the importance of that. Between Tamarack and Englewood, we have about 200 lots that are vacant. There's also vacant lots on the shoreline. And if you've been listening to the city council meeting, there's been a lady who I've never met who's calling in, and she sounds very similar in the concerns that we have. And then we also have areas around Pine and Beaver Lake. So there's a lot of areas to consider in this city. So the docket requests are very serious, and I know that staff has really been working with us. And tonight for the agenda topic, there's development regs too, but the dockets were things that were not taken in the development regs too. So if there's any way they could fit in there, I'd appreciate that. So thank you for listening to me. And I think the live just got its audio back, so congratulations.
Thank you, Mary. And yes, for those who are just joining us, we were having some issues with the sound, but it does look like it is back up and working now. Thank you for your comments. It looks like our third caller is no longer tuned in, so I'll pass it back to Chair Boffman. Thanks, everyone, for your patience.
Okay, thank you. So we have one item on the agenda tonight. It's under old business, but it's a further discussion, presentation, and discussion about development regulation updates, kind of development regulations phase 2. So David, I think you're going to introduce this.
Yes, thank you, Mark, or Chair Boffman. David Pyle, Community Development. Tonight, we have a presentation for you on the list of topics and some proposed resolutions for the Development Regs Update Phase 2. The idea here tonight is that we'll be able to walk through the list, identify which ones we want to focus on, spend some time discussing them, get some feedback from the Commission that we can then use in helping steer the upcoming Community Advisory Group meeting in the upcoming weeks help us continue to prepare some code amendments that we can then bring back to you. So following meeting with the community advisory group, we'll be coming back to you with some proposed code amendments. Tonight with us, we have Framework, our consultants. We have Jeff Arango and Leslie Bain from Framework to present to you, and they'll assist in your walking through the list and collecting comments on you on these topics. I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Great, thank you, David. So everyone should be able to see my screen with the presentation. And just wanted to thank the commission again for the opportunity to be here tonight. We have a presentation to share with you in the beginning, and then as David said, towards the end, we can go over the longer list that I believe you were sent of the code topics and talk about some of the prioritization for how we move those to the next steps. So let me just, my screen, full screen. Okay. And this is a similar presentation that we gave a couple of weeks ago. We had a staff workshop, which was a great discussion, and we got feedback from the staff. So that's where some of these materials come from. So we'll start with a quick update on the project status. We will review initial survey results. So we had a survey, public survey that ran for about 30 days. We have some residential development examples that myself and Leslie Bain will go through, and then we can have some discussion at the end on the list of code topics. So to start, just a quick update on the schedule. As we were going through the next year or so for this project and looking at all of the different dates for meetings and requirements to get materials to the City Council and the Planning Commission in advance, we have extended the timeline a little bit. Originally, we were planning to be done in September. We're now planning to be done in early November, and that's just simply to have sufficient time between meetings to produce materials and be prepared for public hearings. We anticipate having public hearings on the phase 2 development regulations in the spring, and then have hearings in the early fall on the Unified Development Code when that work will begin first of the year in 2021. Here are the survey results. So as I said, this ran for about 30 days. This first question just asked people to describe their role in the community, and these responses are not intended to be mutually exclusive. So most of the respondents were residents and also homeowners is what I would interpret from this, but also a small number of business owners, 6 described as other, 1 renter, and 1 developer. So the first question asked people to rate the impact of new residential development on the character of existing Sammamish neighborhoods and whether they felt it was contributing in a positive way or much worse than before. And pretty resoundingly, the respondents felt that development was either somewhat worse at 39 responses or the highest response, 48, much worse than before. So this is a small sample size, but I think the results are pretty clear. And I would say is fairly consistent with input we've heard from some of our other meetings, including the Community Advisory Group. The next question asks, what elements do you feel are essential to the desired character of Sammamish? The top response at 93, tree preservation and wooded character. And again, very consistent with what we've heard in our smaller group conversations. From there, it was kind of a mix. All of these features actually rated quite high, and those include protection of steep slopes, natural drainage patterns, residential streets with sidewalks and street trees, off-street trails, small-scale development, mostly residential. And then there was 24 respondents that listed other and were able to identify other character elements. As we continue to process these results, we'll put together a more detailed summary that'll have those results in there as well. So we would take this to be an affirmation that all of these elements are important in the eyes of the respondents. Next question is a ranking question. What do you see as the most significant problems experienced while the development is in process? So this is dealing with particularly issues during construction, similar to the comments just made by Mary Victor. The top response at 2.34, which indicates that it's the most significant problem, because the lower the number, the higher the ranking. Habitat and wetland impacts related to tree removal, grading, and development was the highest. The next was inability to have a voice, to not feel heard or represented by the city. The next, third highest response was infrastructure impact due to heavy equipment deteriorating and blocking the right of way. And these are all topics that we've also heard in our smaller group discussions. Other responses were timeline fatigue, that permitting takes several years and residents are continually required to have to engage in the process, noise and vibration, hours of operation for large equipment and trucks, coordination of multiple agencies and departments, and the permitting process is too cumbersome was the lowest response. Question 5 was another ranking question. What do you see as the most significant problems with residential development outcomes? So this is once construction is complete and the development is in place. Again, the highest ranked was development construction impacts on the environment, wildlife habitats, and natural features. So even after construction is complete, there's feeling that those impacts are enduring. Infrastructure is not keeping up with the pace of development. And the next highest, actually the next two were pretty close. Projects do not work with their physical and natural surroundings, and developments are not compatible with the city's existing and desired character. Question 6, again, a ranking question. What do you see as the best solutions to improve residential development outcomes in Sammamish? The highest ranked response was stronger protections for significant natural features such as trees and wetlands, followed by improved standards for the design of major residential streets, and third, improved monitoring and code enforcement of construction projects, especially in critical areas. Question 7 asks respondents to rank potential elements for phase 3 code updates. Number 1, not surprisingly, add elements related to environmental sustainability. Again, we know this is an important theme in the comprehensive plan and consistent with other input we've received. Design and improved walkability of neighborhoods. And third, add flexibility to improve school development. And the other responses you can see there below, but those were the top 3. So those are the results of the survey. And again, we'll be providing a more detailed summary of the responses to that, including the responses to any of the other categories. So now I'd like to just touch on some of the highlights of the code audit as we've been going through the code in more detail and getting input from various stakeholder groups. The first slide deals with neighborhood design. And the first is something that we've brought up previously and I think mentioned at the last Planning Commission meeting, but it's that the code lacks residential neighborhood design standards, commonly referred to as subdivision standards. There are requirements, there are legal requirements, there are process requirements, but they're not really design standards in the way that we see other communities have them. So that's a really important issue. And I think when we get to discussing the longer list of topics, it's something we've identified as a high priority, something that is more of a complex issue, certainly something we can tackle as part of this phase, but something that will require more discussion and certainly work with the Planning Commission and other groups. Projects do not fit in with the natural and physical context. Again, very clear in the response to the survey and other input that many people in the community feel this way. And I think that relates to the first bullet in that those standards could be integrated into the subdivision standards as part of the design of residential neighborhoods and also applied at the site level as well for those existing lots that are being developed. Lack of street connectivity creates transportation and infrastructure challenges. So many of the streets in the community do not connect, which is an attractive, maybe attractive for residents, to minimize traffic. Certainly understand that, but it does create challenges for transportation and for infrastructure by limiting the amount of connections, by limiting the number of routes that you can take to get to your destination, and channelizing traffic on the major arterials. Open space could be better integrated into design of projects. It's great that the city has open space requirements, but in some cases, and not in all cases, it seems like it's a bit of an afterthought. It's sort of the leftover space, and could be sort of more celebrated in a better way and better integrated. And then the last one, the role of on-street parking should be clarified. We've heard input that at times the on-street parking in some of these neighborhoods can be very full. But a cursory review of some of the recent projects shows between the number of stalls that are on site between the driveway and the garage and on street, we're talking 6 or more stalls per housing unit. There might be a way to better right size that for the needs of the neighborhood to ensure, of course, that there is enough parking, but not too much. And these highlights deal with site design. So like the design of specific housing units, or most commonly a single family parcel. And the first one is a big one. There's actually no minimum lot size. And we have some graphics and can talk through this in more detail, but there's no minimum lot size. When you go and subdivide a property, the land that's used for streets and open space can be calculated as part of your density. There are some reasons to allow that, commonly referred to as a form of clustering or by reducing lot sizes. And there could be some criteria to develop, but it does create a lack of predictability, which is challenging in the design of those individual sites. The next one's also a major factor. There's limited controls for the bulk and scale of buildings. And this is something, again, we've heard from our initial public outreach. In the code, there is a lot coverage limit, and many cities will consider lot coverage to apply to all impervious surfaces like the driveway or your deck, or probably your patio more commonly. But in the Sammamish, it only applies to the actual building footprint, which allows for fairly large homes on very small lots, even in districts like the R4, which should technically be 1 unit per 4 units per acre. We're getting much smaller lot sizes in reality that are being developed, and we can show some examples of that. The next one, parking and access have a high impact on development quality. This is not as much an issue in your low density districts like R1, where you have larger lot sizes. But as you start to get into the more dense districts up towards R12 and R18, how you organize access for vehicles and people to individual units is a really important consideration, whether you should use alleys or not to provide some of that access and provide a better streetscape that minimizes conflicts between vehicles and pedestrians are some of the things that we'd like to explore with you tonight as well. And then there's a kind of a lack of housing diversity due to limited use types, but that's not entirely the issue. There are a limited number of housing types that are allowed, but at the same time, the city does allow single families and duplexes and ADUs, and for whatever reason, we don't have any indication that it's a code problem, but are not generally being utilized. Townhouses are allowed in a number of districts, but in some of the lower density districts, it's probably not the most viable or economically viable option at a low density. As you get up to the R12 and R18, it certainly does start to work. And apartments are also permitted in some of the more dense districts as well. So some consideration of perhaps allowing some different types of housing, and we'll provide some examples of that in a few moments. Okay, so now we're going to walk through some examples, and I'm going to turn it over to Leslie here in a minute. But we just wanted to prep that with a couple of discussion questions that we can get into towards the end of the presentation. And the first thing we'd like to start with is the vision for the comp plan. This sets the stage for all planning in the community And the city's got a really strong and great vision statement that addresses, desired development and character. And so one of the questions we'd like to hear from you later is, is development in Sammamish achieving that vision? And then the second one, what site design features have the greatest impact on development quality and character? Put more simply, what do we most care about? What's most important? And how do we integrate that into the regulations to ensure that we're getting the outcomes that we'd like? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Leslie Bain, to walk through these next few slides.
Great, thank you. We'd like to start with what's in your comprehensive plan and be respectful of all the work and the comments that have gone into generating that vision for the community. And I guess it's a good sign that your comprehensive plan and what we've been getting in terms of feedback are very much aligned. People want a well-preserved natural environment. That's certainly one of the reasons people have moved to Sammamish. Family-friendly, kid-safe. They also talk about unrivaled connectedness, an expanding tree canopy, peaceful neighborhoods, multimodal transportation, affordability, and sustainability. So words are easy, and a lot of times people have different visions of what those words mean. So we put together some slides about what we thought maybe people meant to kind of help us have that discussion. Okay, Jeff. So the well-preserved natural environment, the wooded areas, the remnant wooded areas, the places where you can see what's going on with the water, are beautiful and give character to the city. Okay, next. Some very interesting examples that people are doing some really good jobs where they're creating streets and open spaces that I was out there on a sunny day, and there were people out using the spaces. There were streets that were designed in the sort of Dutch Wonerf model to share kids and vehicles on slow, low-volume streets where people could actually use the streets to play. Kids were doing that. I didn't take too many pictures of the kids, but places where there was clustering around open space. So there was actually really good models of some higher densities that were doing good jobs of preserving views and creating spaces that people use. Okay, next. Unrivaled connectedness, the idea of places where you can walk, even when you've got sort of cul-de-sacs for vehicles, connectedness for people and bikes. And there's one of those signs that they take from the Dutch. So what does it mean to be connected in terms of both vehicles and people walking and biking, especially for the kids? And Jeff's correct. There's an upside and a downside to having more vehicular connectivity. And certainly the peaceful neighborhoods are quiet, but again, it does funnel all your traffic into a few locations, which has other problems. Okay, next. Sustainability is something that comes up in various different ways, talking about the stormwater, talking about the tree canopy. And we're well aware that King County has a lot of regulations about how you treat stormwater facilities, but there certainly are examples where the stormwater is visible and beautiful. So the more that we can have it be visible and beautiful and be something that kind of reveals what the natural systems are doing, it's a wonderful thing. Next. Peaceful neighborhoods. I mean, that's a great couple of words there, and there are lots of them. And I think the ones that seem peaceful are not dominated by cars. They have that canopy. They feel comfortable to walk in. So those are the kinds of things that we're interpreting in your vision language. Next. So site planning is something that really is important because with all the architectural guidelines in the world, if you get the site planning wrong, it's hard to recover from that. So the things that really help are trying to fit the development into the site rather than strong-arming the site into making your development easier. So keeping tree and habitat where you can, working with topography, and a lot of the sites that are left to develop have a lot of topography. And there's a lot of trade-offs, in how we use cars. So this was a pretty interesting site plan off of 228th. It's an older development, but they do some really interesting things about having vehicles come in off of alleys, and that means that the homes can front on green spaces. It's super kid friendly. There were kids playing in those sort of shorter alleyways with, I think they were playing cricket, I think. And the homes fronting on the parks is very pleasant. So this is one approach in subdivisions that can work really well. Next. Here's the buildings on that. So you can see them fronting on the parks. You can see the kids playing in the alleyways. So it's actually a great way to kind of help build community. The street-facing houses don't have a 3-car garage in them. So, you know, this is not the only way to do anything, but it is a nice model, and you have good models. Okay, next. Frontage is a big deal. That's really where the public and the private sort of come together. And as Jeff was saying earlier too, when you've got a large lot condition, it's really easy. You know, you put a driveway in there and, you know, leave some vegetation and you're all set. Next. So there are wonderful examples where people have integrated large lot residential with the environment. These are in there just kind of fun. They're probably really expensive homes, so they're not going to hit your affordability. But the Pacific Northwest has a tradition of Northwest architecture, and it's a beautiful thing. Okay. So when you get to the denser areas, and with modern life and the desire for many vehicles, you start seeing these, what some people call snout houses. It's all garage, and then you've got an entry to the house somewhere. But it really makes for a street that is too wide, people drive too fast. Then a lot of times people are using the garage for something else, and you get the cars parked out there anyway. So, you know, if there are some ways of leaving the vegetation, of minimizing the amount of street that is all driveway. And again, like what was said earlier, that impervious surface doesn't even count in your coverage. So there's no penalty to have the asphalt that's clear across your frontage. So those are some issues to think about and take an attitude towards. Next. Yeah, so again, these are some different ways of having cars in frontage. The idea of having on-street parking, which isn't always looked on well in some suburban locations, but it does buffer streets from homes. And if you've got a street that is that wide, it actually kind of slows the cars down. There are other solutions, kind of tucking cars in between homes. But these are driven by, you know, people's preferences and what developers feel are the preferences of their home buying customers. But there are a lot of different models, and you have a bunch of them in your town already. Okay. I think it's important to think about what yards are for, what a 20-foot setback in the front does for you, what a rear yard does for you. It's typically where the kids play. Front yards are great if people actually use them. Sometimes if they're not used, you end up just widening a vast street. So really understanding what those are used for. Side yards mean you can have windows, a little bit of privacy, but really deciding in these denser areas what the best function of that space is, so you're using it well. You're using it for tree preservation or you know, kids' play area or garden. And this is just an example of a house where there is a porch and people clearly are using it. You can tell when you walk around where there's kids' toys around and gardening stuff. Those are useful kind of front yards. Okay. Some of the denser models, this was a really interesting development where the houses fronted on some different characters of open space. It was great. There were neighbors out talking to each other. There were kids playing. There are pathways here. So I think there's some clues about how some of these denser models can function for families and inform the code for these larger or these denser kinds of developments. Next. There are a variety of models that don't often show up in the Northwest. And I think this is really important for the infill factors, because a lot of where the development is going to come from are these lots that have just been undeveloped over time. But there are some ways where a little bit of density can actually fit in very well into neighborhoods. The accessory dwelling units are becoming more common around the region. Don't know exactly why they aren't being built in Sammamish, because you do have the ability to do that. Maybe people haven't just quite discovered it yet, but it's a great way to put your mother-in-law or your son or whoever's home zooming with you. Twins are another common historic way to go that is a really good way to get affordable housing into a community. We worked on one some years ago where one unit was subsidized and one unit was market rate, but someone could buy their first home and use the revenue from the affordable unit that was attached to pay their mortgage. So it's a really interesting way of getting some mix of income or demographics and still having something that fits beautifully into your neighborhoods. The one on the upper right is actually a house that we had in Boston, which was remarkably cheap and had 2 family units. One upstairs had 3 bedrooms, and we rented that out. It paid our mortgage. But it's this beautiful house that fits into the neighborhood, but still allowed 2 families to live there very happily. These are just some examples of some homes that are a little bit denser, but they're lovely. So I think, you know, architects, my profession has not always done the best job of making denser residential that fits into the neighborhoods. And it's highly possible, whether, you know, that's a design guideline issue or, you know, what we can do to encourage housing that people like. You know, we're there to help you do that. The one down on the lower left is in Sweden, in Malmo. It's one of the most gorgeous, environmentally sound housing developments I've ever seen. If you get a chance to see it, go to Sweden someday. New Holly has some interesting houses that front the park, and again, just figuring out how the cars work versus the pedestrians. Okay. Streets, this is connectivity, again, the no outlet versus how do we connect. So I think that, you know, Sammamish has grown without necessarily figuring out how all these things connect, whether it's roads or utilities, and having a little bit of that strategy might be helpful, and recognizing that there are trade-offs between the calming and the connectivity. Streets don't have to be all the same. The rural by design kind of approach is great, where you feel comfortable and the street is narrow and it feels less for the cars than it is for getting around. Okay. The edges are really important. One thing I know you've all talked about is those edges where you've got walls, where you've got topographic changes, and it's not so much the fence. So, you know, upper left, you've got a fence and it's not so great. Lower left, you've got a fence, but it's behind a buffer, a landscape buffer. So a lot of the answers to this is landscape buffer. It makes a big, big difference because that's where the public sees. Okay. And getting the street to be the right size. And you've done some of that. So I think taking a look and seeing how some of these examples in the city are working would be great. You've got some sort of Voner streets. This one actually pulled a little bit of landscape out. So I think that people shouldn't have to put up signs like that backwards one that says, drive like your kids live here. It should be designed so that people actually behave the way you want them to. Nobody's going to race down that street. They would if it were 40 feet wide. So there's a lot of learning right there in your community, and I think that it will be, I look forward to talking to you guys about it. Yeah, that's the kind of rural by design feel there. That's what Sammamish used to look like, because I knew it then. So what landscape can do to the edges is really important, and it's good for habitat. It's cheaper than a lot of other things, so it's good on a ton of levels. Yeah, just one more on the infrastructure, and if that stormwater can be thought of to be not only functional, but visible, beautiful and educational. Making the invisible forces of nature visible is great. Okay, so those were just some images that we thought would help us all have the same kind of vocabulary when we're talking about these words that are so important. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Leslie. So we're going to conclude with a couple of examples, development examples for each of the zoning districts. And the photo examples that Leslie showed are great. You can see all the details. You can see the landscape and kind of really get a sense of look and feel. But it's also informative to sort of strip away some of those elements and kind of look at just kind of the raw physical characteristics of these districts and sort of how development is occurring based on the current standards. So this example is actually from the Tree Farm development, which has come up a few times as an example of a neighborhood that people really like. And not surprisingly, it does have a very wooded character. And those of you familiar with it will know that. Not only is the character of the individual home sites wooded, the streets have a very wooded feel. There's also a wooded buffer along the arterial, which is very nice. And because the lots at R1 are quite a bit larger, you don't run into some of the challenges that Leslie just described, where you have, the whole frontage is driveway, and sort of overwhelming in the sense of the cars or the size of the home on the lot. Are less issues. It's got a nice trail system with it, and again, it has a really nice kind of character. The houses have a little bit of variety to them. But even though it's R1, this lot example is quite a bit smaller at 12,000 square feet, so more like a quarter of an acre. And the lot sizes do vary a little bit in that neighborhood. So that's R1. R4, starts to get a little bit more interesting. This is an example of a newer project. And to describe what I said earlier around there not actually being a minimum lot size. So in a lot of jurisdictions, if they are a zoning district, they might have a minimum lot size that was equivalent to a quarter of an acre. It's about 11,000 square feet. In Sammamish, you are able to reduce your lot size and count streets and other open spaces, your stormwater area for that. So you actually end up with lots that are quite a bit smaller. Not to say that that's necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, but this lot example is down to 6,750 square feet, so roughly half of what a quarter acre lot would be. And you see as those lot sizes become smaller, you end up with a good portion of the frontages is all driveway. It makes on-street parking difficult because there just isn't simply enough space between the driveways to do it. You can see the homes are very large on the lot, in part because the coverage standard of 40%, I believe it's 40% in this district. So that means that you could have roughly 3,000 square foot footprint on that lot, and at a two-story building, you're talking a very large home. So those are some of the issues that we see with not having a minimum lot size, and there are different approaches in how to address that. You could choose to implement a minimum lot size. There are other things like having floor to area ratios, so how big, basically having restrictions on the side of the house that scale with the size of the lot. Bigger lot can have a bigger house, smaller lot can have a smaller house. While still keeping reasonable limits, of course. This is another example of R4. This is in one of the older neighborhoods. And again, these lots have a much more wooded character. You can see quite a bit of trees, both within the public right-of-way and on the rear of that lot. It does have a very wide driveway, but this is actually all in the public right-of-way. So even though the right-of-way is 50 feet wide, only 20 feet of it is improved, kind of creating this kind of no man's land between those. So you have this wide driveway and this is often used for like informal parking and things like that. Here, the garage is a little bit separated from the house, which is different than typically what we're seeing in newer developments. Creates informal on-street parking areas, and again, these typically don't have sidewalks, but there may be opportunities to add them in the future. It's something that I think we want to consider. So now we're going up to the R6 district, and again, related to the lack of a minimum lot size, you end up with a lot of very similar developments between the R4, the R6, and the R8. The lot sizes actually don't differ a whole lot. In this case, you are a bit less than the examples I just showed for the R4, but you're down to about a 5,000 square foot lot. We did calculate the floor to area ratio just to give a sense of how big some of these homes are relative to the lot. And this home has a square footage that's 0.7 or 70% of the size of the lot. That's pretty high for a single family home. You would typically see FARs of that, more in kind of small scale neighborhood commercial areas. Again, the other thing to point out here is with the large garage, 30 feet of frontage is driveway. So a good portion, again, of the frontage is driveway. And again, the development is very similar to what you see in the R4. So here we are in the R8, and we have a lot size. This is an example from 2001. You have a lot size that's only 500 square feet than the example we looked at in R6. We're down to 4,400. Again, large home on a small lot, floor to area ratio of about 73.73 or 73%. The driveway width is a little bit narrower here, which is a little bit better, I think, than the previous example. Also, the orientation of the house is a little bit narrower profile at the street edge, which tends to create a little bit more variety and minimize kind of the bulk and scale as it would appear as a pedestrian or someone on the street. Again, half the lot is impervious surface. There is a wooded buffer behind it, and the concentration of driveways start to become more of an issue as the lot sizes get smaller and the density increases. This is an example from 1993. This is in the R12 zone. And I think, we're down to 3,400 square foot lots, but the FAR is a bit smaller. So the homes are a little bit smaller relative to the lot size. But the big change here is that these are alley loaded. So they're accessed to garages from the rear alley. It does, of course, minimize the rear yard, or basically there is no rear yard, but the alley can serve a social function as well for kids to play and things like that. But you get a much better experience as a pedestrian. You don't have to contend with cars trying to park and things like that. Not that that's necessarily a huge issue, but it does create a very different feeling, I think, at the streetscape level. So now we have two more examples for the R18. These are townhouse developments. These tend to be on one large parcel, so we haven't shown a minimum lot size for these. But this one, I think what stands out to us is that a lot of the frontage is driveways. There's really no delineation between where people are supposed to walk or where cars are supposed to park. So it's a very kind of auto-oriented development pattern here. There's no dedicated pedestrian or bike access along there. This is another R18 development, which still has front access off of the street, but it's done a little bit differently. One, the driveways are spread out. They're pretty narrow at 16 feet. They also have some pretty nice, pedestrian access that's clearly delineated. They have a sidewalk, which the other example didn't. The buildings are a little bit narrower profile at the street. So I think this one has some better qualities than the previous example. And the final slides are looking at the street standards. So the city went through, I think, a process around 2016 to develop the current public works standards. And so there's different streetscape designs that are connected to the different zoning districts. So in the R1 and the R4, your typical right-of-way is about 55 or maybe even 60 feet. Travel lanes are 10 feet, which is good. That's a pretty, reasonable lane width. It has one lane of on-street parking. So the assumption is with less density at these districts, you could have less on-street parking with only one lane, whereas you get to the R6, you have 2 lanes of parking. But as I said earlier, the development density, the actual built density in the R4 compared to the R6 and the R8 is very minimal. So there might be some recalibration here, regarding which standard applies to which type of development, and it might be something that's more tied to the actual built net density as one option. The 8-foot planting buffer is very nice. Some of those examples Leslie showed are the peaceful neighborhoods where the trees are kind of brought more out into the street. There's also examples where you can kind of integrate a buffer and a parking lane so that there's kind of pockets of parking, but then there's actual landscape areas that are within what is otherwise the parking lane and can sort of narrow the view and serves as a traffic calming measure and creates, again, more of kind of a wooded character. But this is I think a reasonable streetscape. I think it's just more a matter of how it's applied and in what type of context. But certainly a big improvement in some of the streets that we've seen that were built under some of the previous standards. So again, the big difference here as you get to R6 and higher is the planting buffer is reduced to about 5 feet and you end up with the 2 lanes of parking. One of the big things to consider when you have 2 lanes of parking, and since there's typically sufficient parking in driveways for a lot of these homes, sometimes the parking isn't used regularly. And so if you end up with 2 10-foot travel lanes and then 16 feet for the parking lanes and there's no cars parked there, it's essentially going to feel almost like a 36-foot wide road. And that typically leads to faster travel speeds and potential safety issues and concerns, and impacts on the residents as well from traffic speeding, and that results in the signs to slow down, and that Leslie showed in a few minutes ago. The minor arterial collector, so these are the major roads kind of into and out of some of the new developments. These have 2 travel lanes and a turning lane, which may be appropriate, for accessing, providing access to larger scale developments. You got the 5-foot bike lanes, which is nice, and then the 5-foot buffer and the 6-foot sidewalk. We have heard from some of the discussions with the Sammamish Plateau Water District about potential conflicts between landscaping areas and infrastructure. So that's something we're going to take a look at. That is a 68-foot right-of-way for that minor arterial collector. And this is another version. This just shows some of the minor collectors have not been fully improved. So this is an example of one that's only been improved to 39 feet. This was likely developed under a previous standard, but it's got 2 11-foot lanes and the 5-foot shoulder, which could be used for biking, the 6-foot sidewalk and the 5-foot buffer. So there may be a desire to fully improve these streets potentially in the future. And then the major arterial, again, these are the ones that carry the most significant traffic volumes in the city, and these can be a 4 or 5 lane section. The 5-lane section here has 2 travel lanes and the center turn lane. But one of the things that stands out here is that you have a very wide vehicle section with 5 lanes, and yet you have a narrower planting buffer and sidewalk than you do even on some of the low volume streets. So typically we like to consider, if possible, if there's enough space, maybe bumping up the buffer because there is so much vehicle traffic on these streets, and perhaps even considering a wider sidewalk or a trail. There's a great examples of trails and the system in Sammamish. Those might be some things to consider to sort of offset the impacts from those significant traffic carriers. And that's that. The last piece is we can go into the longer list of code topics and talk about priorities. But I think before we do that, I'll pause and see if there's any comments, questions, or discussion on what we just presented.
Anybody have any comments? Larry?
Go ahead, Mark. I had two things that I noticed. First of all, way back in the vision statement, it said family friendly, and then kids, and one of the terms I'm thinking of senior citizens are golden ages, and it's just something I think we should put someplace in the vision statement. The seniors, the golden agers. Okay, so, and the other item was I noticed one of the pictures when you were showing streets had the rounded curves, and did anybody want to talk about rounded curves versus non-rounded curves? Okay.
Yeah, good one. Well, there's an example of the rolled curve. I believe those have been disallowed under the updated public works standards. So certainly open to discussing it, but
it's correct. They're disallowed.
Yeah, that was from the 90s, that development.
Yeah. So if it's something you want to revisit, we could, but I mean, I think our impression is that was the right move. Oftentimes that comes with no buffer. It's basically just a spot to kind of walk by as fast as you can. It's not really an enjoyable experience. So, I think we would support the city's decision to disallow them.
Josh, did you have something? Go ahead.
I do. I've got a couple. Twin houses were shown. Are they not allowed in code right now? Is that why you brought that up?
No, they are. The duplexes are allowed in some of the districts, but it doesn't. Our impression is it's not being built that often. So it was just an example of a built example of that.
Okay, so the label was twin houses. I've always heard them referred to as duplexes. So is that just another word for them?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
And then
twins are kind of a subset of duplexes, and they often are the same. They don't have to be, but yeah, duplexes can be a lot of different designs.
Got it. Okay, thank you. And it was you had the parking for R4 versus R6 in the density that in reality wasn't that much different. So could the standard we have for R4 work for R6? Is there like a capacity count on the number of stalls that are actually being used on the street?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something that we are going to do that analysis. We have not gotten to that point. But yeah, I think, it's a little bit of question at this point whether the R1, R4 example would actually work for R6 and R8 or vice versa. And it might depend because, again, at least under current code, there is flexibility on the lot sizes that are provided. And so there might be criteria for how that's applied. I would tend to think that the R1 to R4 example would probably work in most situations, particularly where there's generally sufficient off-street parking provided on the individual lots. But it kind of depends on what's actually being proposed. But yes, I think there is a recalibration of how these are applied. Absolutely.
So this is David Pyle. If I could just jump in here for a second. If you all recall, as part of phase 1 development regs update, we did add a requirement that there be additional equivalent, what it says is equivalent on-street parking provided. And so we as staff have contemplated that requirement quite a bit. And this is a good opportunity for us to, with Jeff's assistance, clean that up a bit. So we've already taken the initial step to make that statement to builders, designers, et cetera, that when you're designing a project, you have to account for functional on-street parking. Whereas in the past, Leslie showed and Jeff showed a series of slides that show dysfunctional streets that don't really allow for the use of the parking area because the curb cuts are too short. There's a mailbox in the way. The driveways oppose each other in the wrong place, so that it just doesn't work. Because designers aren't forced to think through how that all interplays with itself. So I think what Jeff is working on here is taking that to the next step. So we've already taken the first big step there. This next step is about refining it and figuring out how to make it work and add some design standards.
Yeah. Yeah, well said, David. I think these types of projects, we tend to focus on the negative, but I think, this is, to me, mostly positive. I don't think it's necessarily being completely applied correctly to David's comment, but as a standard, it's it's good. It's definitely a major improvement on what you had previously. So
Okay, I've got two more if that's okay.
Yeah.
The next one is on the minor arterial and collector. Let's see what I wrote. Why not have the bike lane next to the sidewalk with the buffer between the bike lane and the street? I don't know the science behind that decision.
Yeah.
That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, no, you're right on. That would be a preferred option. Certainly better for bike safety. It's been shown to increase use. And certainly protected bike lanes are becoming more common. If the bike lane and the sidewalk were combined, you could go with like a multi-use path option, which would allow bi-directional travel and is more suitable to kind of lower volume situations. But yeah, that's a great comment. Not something that I had initially thought of, but something that we will explore more for sure. Yeah, thanks.
This is David Pyle. Let me throw in one more comment there. If you haven't had a chance to walk the new section of 4th Street that was built, there's some interesting combinations of sidewalks and bike lanes and ramps, and it flows pretty well. And I think that gives you a realistic idea of what it feels like. Get your bike out, bike over there, check it out. It's a pretty interesting setup on that new street that was just opened.
Okay, good note. I'll do that. And then bike lanes on major arterials. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think it would be desirable to have them, right? I suspect it's simply a space issue. Because of the traffic volumes, there's a certain requirement for capacity. And, having a 4-lane road without a turning lane can be problematic. So I suspect it's a space issue and would either require expanding the right-of-way, which is often difficult or not even possible, or doing some sort of road diet, which again may not be possible on streets that have sufficiently high traffic volumes. So again, it's something we can explore further, but yeah, I think those are likely the factors as to why there are not bike facilities on several of these streets.
So if I could also chime in here, I'm sorry to keep jumping in. I just want to make sure to clarify some things. So the way the city's rules are currently set up, and I think one of the conversations we're having is how should we have them set up and going forward is currently we have public works standards that are separate from the zoning controls. So our zoning controls live in our code in Title 21A. Unless you're in town center, then it's 21B. And then the city's public works standards apply separately. The city's public works standards are applied through the right-of-way requirements of 14A. So what happens is you come in when you want to design a subdivision, you need to think about not only the design standards of 21A, but also the public works standards because you're required to build right-of-way. So one thing we could do is we could add a layer in 21A that provides certain design requirements for streetscapes that would enhance what is required in the public works standards. I don't think as part of this project we have the capacity to crack open the public works standards and take on 17. The city had a set of interim public works standards that were in place from incorporation all the way until 2017, and there were several attempts to update those that stalled out. It's a pretty intense topic to take on. So I would in this case advise against trying to crack open the public works standards, and instead I would focus on adding complementary streetscape design requirements to go along with subdivisions that would enhance the public works standards that are in place, as opposed to actually opening the public works standards.
Thanks.
Okay, and that ends the series of questions I had. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Josh. Others have comments, questions?
Yeah, hi, this is Karthik. I have questions. I want to go back to the survey results. I think there was like 108 responses. We are a city of about 65,000 people. I don't know if that is, indicative. First of all, I didn't know about the survey. I would like to know how it was actually conducted. And I also would like to see if 100 people or 125 people or maybe 200 people, I don't know how many people applied or took the survey, out of 65,000, is that the normal response typically you see for these surveys? While I do generally agree with what is being shown as the output, I'm just curious on these two factors here.
Yeah, no, really good question. So the survey was administered through the Connect Sammamish platform, which is a localized version of an outreach tool called Bang the Table, kind of a funny name. But it's used basically for public outreach for municipal planning projects and other types of projects as well. And they have a built-in survey feature, and that's how it was administered. Again, this was not set up to be a statistically valid survey, since that requires a lot more effort and resources to be able to do that. But I would say, as you pointed out, it's a fairly low response rate for a city of this size. It's not completely uncommon. It kind of depends on the issue. One of the types of work that we do a lot of is downtown parking studies. And because everyone seems to be interested in parking, those we get very high responses. Some have been 3,000, 4,000, or 5,000. But on some of the more focused planning projects, responses in numbering a few hundred is not necessarily uncommon. Although it is, somewhat disappointing we didn't get more. It is reassuring that it is consistent with what we've heard from others that we've spoken to as part of the process.
Got it, thank you. I also had one more question. There was one slide that talked about lacking division character. Maybe if you can just scroll a few slides.
Character elements. There was one on rating the character.
No, it was like a subdivision character. Our Sammamish lacks subdivision characters. I wasn't sure what right there. The code lacks residential neighborhood design, subdivision standards.
Yeah. Yep.
My primary question is, do we expect our subdivisions to look the same across the city, or what exactly does that really mean? Can I get
Yeah, so when you go to do a subdivision, you have a plot of land, you have to lay out your streets, you have to decide where your open space is going to go, you have to decide where your stormwater facilities are going to go, you have to design, where your streets connect. And I would say compared to other cities, there's really not a lot of guidance on that. And I would say that for most cities that have these types of standards, there are things that are standardized and things that you want relatively to be similar, and there are things that you would want to be based on the site context, right? For example, if you have a flat site, doing a gridded pattern probably makes a lot of sense. There are challenges of trying to apply a grid on a very hilly site. Some site may be completely forested and provide opportunities for tree preservation and tree canopy and a number of the things that were mentioned in the vision. So it's a mix of things that are prescriptive, like street standards and things like that, and then there are things that allow some flexibility for designers to come up with good solutions. But it would be things like maybe don't just put a stormwater pond in the corner along the arterial and put a chain link fence around it. Maybe there's a way to have more vegetation that's part of it. Maybe there's a way to integrate a trail around it or an open space element, so it takes on more like a park-like function. It's those sorts of things that we would look to provide as part of those residential design standards.
I think one of the things you might be thinking about is the style of the house. And we would not be interested in telling people what style of house they have to have. It's really more about the bones of how things are laid out and put on the site and relate to the natural environment and the public realm.
Got it. Now, I do have a couple of follow-up questions, if the chair would allow me. Or am I eating too much time?
Go ahead, Karthik.
Okay. Do we know what codes do we are lacking in standards, right? Do we have a good view of the codes and standards that we have to fix? That's question number one. And question number two is, what is the impact of this lack in standards? Because we've got a huge number of developments that have already been approved in Sammamish over the last 3 years, right? So
yeah, we do have a good sense of the code. I mean, we're going to continue as we start drafting code and proceed along the process. We're going to get more and more familiar with the code, but I would say yes, at this point we have a really a pretty strong handle on that, and we've gotten that from meetings like this, input from the community advisory group, and as well as our own sort of technical analysis, and developing those diagrams was also kind of a deep dive for us to look not only at the code but also at what is actually getting built. And we're going to do a similar set of graphics that just illustrate what the actual code standards are. And then our expectation is going forward, when we figure out exactly what we want, we would do similar graphics like that would be somewhat prescriptive and would kind of clearly communicate the elements of the code and what the requirements are.
Got it. Thank you. Is there a timeline for these codes to be fixed, by the way? Or it's going to be an ever-continuing process?
No, we're planning to have the, so there's two components of the project. So there's the development code updates, and we anticipate those being completed around March or so, at least in draft form, so that we could then go through the public hearing process with the Planning Commission. And then the other component is the Unified Development Code, which will start after the new year. And again, that's a reorganization and consolidation of the code, and that will be completed at the end of the project and hopefully adopted in early November.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Leslie.
Yeah, thanks.
I did want to make one quick comment that's kind of related to what you guys were discussing. Leslie made a comment that we don't want to tell people what kind of house they can have. I do think when you look at those pictures of some of the neighborhoods in Sammamish, particularly the neighborhoods that are desirable, or whatever you want to call it, it does show a little bit about what is desired from a mass and scale standpoint. The imposing nature of some of the structures versus the way that they tend to blend into a neighborhood. I think there is something to be said for, and I know it's in some of the comments about the development regulations, but there is something to be said for not telling people what the house has to look like and not limiting that. But as infill happens and as people try to maximize the use of a lot, perhaps there are some instances in R1 and R4 where there should be some basic parameters for mass and scale. And, you know, maybe I'm crossing the line a little bit, but I also think the general character is, you know, hip type, gable type roofs pretty much throughout the community. And maybe that's something we think about how that works within the standards as well, without crossing the line of telling people that they have to paint their house pink or, you know, do something very specific like that. But I think that there's something to be said about mass and scale and fitting into the character of the community that might be worth considering. And I think those pictures kind of show that.
Yeah, we agree with you. We think mass and scale is part of how the house affects the public realm. So yeah, it's, and different communities have different places they draw that line, but you know, you're not going to be Leavenworth. So.
Yeah, I agree as well, Mark.
Anybody else have any comments or questions? Okay, let's move on.
Okay, I'm gonna just switch screens here real quick. Not switch screens, sorry, switch documents. Sorry, hold on one second here. This out of the way. And okay. You guys probably can't see that. Okay, so this is the table. We have something like 40 to 50 problem statements. So this is kind of the detailed list. And what we've done, myself and David and Sarah Asteri, went through the list and took an initial stab at identifying kind of priorities. And what we mean by priorities is not whether it will get addressed or not. It's just kind of simply the process to move that forward. So a low priority is noted in green, and those are things that we think, you know, we can kind of move forward with drafting that code and bring it back to the Planning Commission and have a review and discussion of that. It's again more simple things like adding definitions and essentially items that don't, in our view, warrant a ton more conversation. Medium would be items that do warrant some more discussion or a little more complicated, a little more in depth. And then high would require significant discussion and you know, effort on our part to develop those code sections, but certainly more discussion before we get to the actual drafting of code stage, because we don't want to go all the way down a road and draft the code only to find out we have to make significant changes to it. So for those bigger items, we want to make sure that we're all on the same page, and certainly this meeting tonight will help us get there. So that's kind of the list. All of these are also a reminder organized by the 8 topics that we categorized these in, and we presented these at one of our prior meetings. So I'll just run through those real quick. Code enforcement and penalties, residential neighborhood design, protection and integration of natural features, standards for non-residential uses in residential zones, things like schools, infrastructure coordination and design, single-family site and building design, construction management, and finally, code organization and administration, which will include the Unified Development Code. So at this time, I'll open it up for some discussion. I mean, we're happy to just like go through each of them on some level, or if those of you that had a chance to review it, if you have initial comments or feedback from us. And I think what we're most looking for is, did we get the priorities right? Is there something in the low that you think, warrants more discussion? You're not comfortable sort of moving it right to the draft code stage, or vice versa. So that's kind of the feedback that we're looking for. But I think our assumption is that the previous meetings were focused on generating this list. And again, this list comes from items that were identified by the city and were included in our scope of work initially. Items that were collected by staff and communicated to us as important elements for the code update, and the docket requests that were referenced at the beginning of the meeting. Those are also incorporated in here as well.
Larry here. I had two that I looked at were 24 and 26. And I wanted to say that I think having what the intended outcome should look like was very important. Let's see, 24, I'm glad we talked about that last time, that work stoppage is still remains in that code. So that's great. And on 26, I kind of have a hunch how that got in there, but I'm sure that other people within the city staff are concerned about volunteers working along street sides like that. It seemed to me it jumped out, and that's different than planting or trees in one of our parks or pulling up weeds. Okay, I just wondered where volunteer came from. And do other cities do that? Okay.
Yeah, it's I actually have a really good example of that from one of a previous project that I did. Certainly understand your concern, and I think it warrants a little bit further discussion and maybe some consideration in terms of a legal review or legal input on that. But there are a number of successful programs that cities have used in terms of volunteers. Probably the best example I can give is Leslie and I actually redesigned a street in downtown Langley on Whidbey Island. Again, it's more of an urban project, but all of the landscaping was installed by volunteers as well as maintained by volunteers. There tends to be a gardening culture there and people that were interested in it. And frankly, they can maintain it on a level that simply the city would not be able to do. And this is always the challenge with landscaping, right? It looks great when you first put it in and it's wonderful. And then if it's not maintained, it becomes a weed bed. And, it's just, we want to be realistic with the city's resources, or make sure that we're installing landscaping that's, kind of minimizes that maintenance. So I think there are potentially opportunities to do this. I don't know exactly what the right mix of it is, but we have definitely seen successful programs that are maintained by volunteers. And there's also cities that require people to maintain their planting strip as well. So there are a couple of different options for that. Thank you. So just to close the loop on that, are you suggesting that perhaps 24 and 26 should be moved up in priority, maybe from low to medium, or was it just kind of a clarifying question?
I would say that, well, clarifying, but I would think 24 makes sense, and I think it could be high. I think it should be high. I think the work stoppage and the raise in the fines are important in many cases. And that's my take.
Okay, great, thank you.
Jeff, can I ask? I got the impression that low, medium, and high was more a reflection of difficulty or challenge or something of that sort rather than priority. I just worry a little bit. I want to make sure that we all recognize that low priority kind of tends to mean something unimportant to most people, I don't think that the
Yeah.
things that are green are low priority. They're just low resistance or less difficult to try to accomplish. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think it's level of effort. Like coming back with a proposal on some of these issues is not much different than coming back with draft code. You know, we're not like risking expending a bunch of resources down a direction that we don't want to go. So that is part of it as well. It's not to say that we're just gonna, you know, move it forward without you know, having more discussion, but we could come up with some draft code relatively easy on that topic, present it to the group, and still have that same discussion. So yes, that's absolutely right. Thanks for clarifying that.
Okay, who else has comments they'd like to go through?
Yes, Mike Brusco here. So actually, building off of what you just said, it seemed to me that perhaps what Commissioner Crandall was saying was more about importance rather than the priority is defined by hard to do versus easy to do. And I actually did have a question if there had been some thought around the importance of the various problems to solve. Like, you know, the priority in terms of importance versus the priority in terms of how hard it is to work on.
Yeah. We have not necessarily done it that way under the assumption that we're going to address all of these. And I would say that's partially why we developed the 8 categories, is to kind of commingle some of these under consistent categories. So we have not done that, but I think some of them clearly stand out to me. The residential design standards, I think, is a huge one. You know, it's not listed as a topic, but it's a big part of the project, which is the Unified Development Code is going to have a huge impact on the ability for the staff to be able to effectively administer the code and others to be able to understand it. So we have not done that, but I would say that there is some relationship between the high items and those that will have the greatest impact, if that makes sense.
Could be, yeah. That's good. Well, it's good to hear that you think you could do most or all of these. And if it does become like a cost or timing issue, then maybe we could talk about relative importance. I have a couple other comments and maybe a question or two. And so one was, as I went through this, I actually had in mind, are these consistent with achieving the vision? And I would say, without parsing by solution by solution, it felt like they were very consistent with the vision that we're trying to achieve. So I think that's really good. One comment, maybe this is something to consider changing. There are several that felt like they were overlapping pretty significantly. Yeah. So for example, and there are several, but just pick one and you know, not to belabor things too much. The problem statement number 20 talked about standards do not reflect site conditions.
Yep.
And it seemed to me that problem statements 4, 5, and 6, wooded nature, topography, buffers, were pretty similar in nature. So it seemed to me that as you work through this, there might be some consolidation that would lead to a simplification. So I think you should consider that. And let's see if there was one other one along that. There's one comment I'd like to make. There was one or two. Problem 23 talked about construction management. And I guess from where I'm coming from and people that I've talked to, the sort of the look and feel, does it fit with the way we like Sammamish to be is more important than what's happening during construction management. And so as a caution, if some of the code becomes a little bit more onerous on something like construction management and causes a trade-off that would be negative to the look and feel and character of Sammamish, I think that's another one where I would probably prioritize, the caution and control around construction management versus, more important around the, the character and the nature of the finished product.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We'll certainly be mindful of that as we move forward. On the issue of consolidation, I think your comments are right on. As I said earlier, we got input on this list from multiple sources, including staff, various people at the city, and the docket requests. And so this initial list, we were sort of attempting to preserve the integrity of those sources, but we're actually moving towards consolidating those, after this meeting. So thank you for those comments.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Josh?
Yeah, realizing that this process looks like it's going to be going up until, November of 2021. What's the rollout look like for this as we go through and you're creating draft code? How is the public seeing that and providing comment, and us? What does that look like as far as schedule goes there?
Yeah, good question. So as I said, I think we're looking at having public hearings towards like the late spring. We find that, large projects like this, it's difficult to do the adoption process in the summer. So you kind of try to structure your schedule around the summer and, understanding that having public hearings in July and things like that don't really work that well. So I think we would plan to have a complete draft code again in the spring. But our approach on the high priority topics is to come back with you with some proposals and materials that are less than the drafted code. It's what we found is, like, if you're dealing with a topic like your residential design standards and we just hand you a draft code, one, it's already baked. It doesn't give us as much opportunity to get your input. And so we would come back with, something that's more like an outline and had graphics and maybe even had some key questions or decision points. We want the commission to be, involved in the process, not just, reactionary. So that's how we would approach it. And then things that are low priority that we think are easy enough to just draft code, we would bring that to you, as soon as it was ready. And we would provide, some summary information that kind of summarized our thinking and sort of how we arrived at those proposals.
Okay, that's good to know, and I ask that because my concern is there are some things in there that definitely make it easier on city staff, which is great, and then there are some things in there that make it life easy on developers, which is also good. But then there are many high priority items that will make neighborhoods better. And what I'm concerned is, as you're rolling things out, that it doesn't just look like our time is being spent making life easier for staff, though I support that, or developers. I want to make sure that the public sees forward progress on, even though it's all going to be roughly done at the same time. I just want to make sure that we're putting the right, public is seeing the right priorities as they might first.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. We do have a presence again on the Connect Sammamish website. We also do have in our scope to do a public event, and if this was not, we weren't impacted by COVID, that would be some sort of in-person like open house event, but we'll try to do something similar with an online event. We can also post materials, of course, on the website. So we're very mindful of the importance of making sure that the public has an opportunity to weigh in and vet that, and that we're sort of meeting, their goals for their neighborhoods and so on.
Okay, that's great. And I didn't see anything on here that I thought should be removed. I thought they were all something that we should address. So I appreciate the effort putting this together and all that.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Anyone else? I had a number of comments. I'm wondering if I could just highlight a couple. One, which pops out in number 3, but really is an overarching comment into the whole thing. I think that it would be important as we go through and talk through some of these, and as you work on them, that we think a bit about how there's a tendency to want to always conceptualize how these would be applied to a large development. But as the city ages and the housing stock ages, there will be a lot of people that will be doing renovations or, I mean, I know a lot of people that because of the housing prices would love to move to a bigger house, but they can't afford it. So they want to add on to their house or change their house to make it work for them. And I want to be careful that we don't create codes and standards that are a penalty to people that have lived here and paid taxes here for 20 years that want to add on to their house because we were so in such a hurry to penalize large developments. And I'm not, maybe penalize is not the best choice of words, but you know, let's keep in mind that these things can be applied to lots of different people and make sure that the changes that we make don't unduly harm people that are, you know, kind of a small, just trying to add a bedroom onto their house in a perfectly reasonable manner. I think that's kind of an important thing, not to wash away some of those folks with being too overly broad with what we're doing. I would also say that I see, well, as a small comment, number 6, a bunch of the text on the version we've got kind of cut out of there, so please be careful.
Oh, yeah.
One of the things in here is there's a number of things that talk about enforcement and the ability to write stop work orders and that sort of thing. I think it's also very important as we work on some of these updates and changes that we give some consideration to the idea that if we define the ability for city staff or inspectors to take action, then there has to actually be people in place to do that. And so if there's not someone available because of staffing and resources or whatever, I don't know what the reasons might be. There might be many reasons. We could write all kinds of rules and penalties and put them in place, and they sound good and they feel good. And then if nobody can ever go out there to inspect or enforce any of it, it's kind of a pointless exercise. So I think we should just be thoughtful about not creating a whole bunch of opportunities for enforcement that will never happen.
Yeah.
There are a few of these things that I felt like we had talked about during phase 1, and I was curious if this has been, this feels like it's the outcome of comments from the survey and from other sources, but maybe has not been necessarily coordinated with the things that we did in phase 1, or am I wrong about that?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding, and David, maybe you could chime in, is that you know, I mean, similar to the list of topics, there's some overlap, that there might be we might be addressing similar issues, but not necessarily in the same manner. So I don't believe it is necessarily overlapping with phase 1. David, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so my sense is that with phase 1 we took on a fairly heavy lift, but the topics themselves were, you know, coarse. I don't want to say crude, but they were coarser, right? There was, aside from the setbacks, which I think was a very fine-tuned analysis done by the Planning Commission, and I really credit the setback scenarios to the Planning Commission, or the dynamic setbacks to the Planning Commission for those ideas and help with that. The rest of it was fairly coarse, and what this is this represents a was a pretty bad echo here, so I don't know if somebody's not muted. This represents a refinement of many of those areas. So for number 6, for example, new development does not often provide an adequate buffer from arterial streets with inconsistent landscaping, fences, and retaining walls that dominate the street frontage. So we did talk a little bit about during phase 1 the idea that we want to make sure we are blending the edges of development with existing development. So if you have a project of a scalable size, a meaningful size that is being built in a neighborhood that's established, maybe there was some large vacant lots or underdeveloped lots, or somebody just found that it was that it penciled out to demolish a block of existing neighborhood, like we've seen happen. that they're being careful to blend the edges of that development so that there is not such a stark transition and impact in character. What we heard during phase one was that people cared a lot about how that blending occurred and the frontage, but they didn't really care so much about what the interior of that new subdivision looked like, meaning that if you chose to buy into that and you're buying into it and you want to live in it, that's your choice. But what they didn't want to have happen was, as a result of that development occurring, degrade the character or change the character of the adjacent neighborhoods in the streetscape. So long as we were able to identify design standards for subdivisions of a scalable size, and to identify protective measures and design requirements for blending around the perimeter of a subdivision, that we could allow for some flexibilities internal to the subdivision. So those are the kind of things we're talking about now, as opposed to in the past, we really were just looking at limits on grading, for example. So we've gone from a coarse tool to looking at how to refine that tool and get really what we're looking for in terms of quality out of development.
Thanks, David. Oh, so I had just a couple of other quick ones. One, there's a lot of discussion in here about sewers and connecting, and septic versus sewers. I would just point out that I just had a recent experience with somebody that I know who their septic system was failing. They were needing to connect to the sewer, and it was between $60,000 and $70,000 to connect to the sewer. And so again, I think that we have to have some level of caution about putting in place requirements that are financially unfeasible for people, and just keep that in mind. The last one is kind of a minor, but number 42. This one, I wasn't sure why it was high instead of low. It looked to me like it was really just a code, perhaps some code modification that wouldn't be that difficult, but maybe there's more to it, and we don't need to get into the details. I just encourage you to look at that one and see if maybe it can be captured with some of the other ones.
Yeah, you might be right on that one. Yeah, thanks. We'll take a look at it.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to talk about that one anytime. I have a lot of upfront and close experience with applicants and developers and neighbors on that one, so happy to discuss that one.
Sounds like we'll have the chance.
Yeah.
Okay, others who have comments or questions? Looks like that's it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Really good meeting, good discussion, great input. We'll make sure that all of your comments are incorporated into our work going forward. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions following the meeting. And we very much look forward to seeing you next time.
Great. I do want to say thanks, Jeff, to you and Leslie. This is encouraging, I think, for a lot of us to get into some of these details, and hopeful, at least at this point, that we can make a difference and improve some of these things. So thank you very much.
And I wanted to add on to what Jeff said and what Mark said, that if any of you have questions or comments on these, please send them my way by email. I'll make sure Jeff and Leslie get a copy of those. Also, if any of you have questions, let me know. I'm happy to talk through any of these items with you. I always learn a lot talking to you all about this. And, as I learn more and as I'm able to, work with Jeff and learn more from Jeff and Leslie on this, we end up with a better code. So really, the more informed we are, the more helpful this is in going forward and getting the right sort of scenarios and proposals in front of you for your consideration. So thank you for your time and work on this.
Okay, thanks. We will move on with the agenda. Next thing on the agenda is agenda item public comment. Jackie, do we have folks on the line to make agenda related public comments?
You currently have 2 callers in. I'll go ahead and read the accessibility one more time in case anyone is just joining us. Pursuant to the Governor's Emergency Proclamation 20-25, the city is unable to provide an in-person location for the public to listen to the virtual Planning Commission meeting this evening. Meetings are still accessible to the public and public comments can still be submitted. Up to 7 minutes of verbal public comment may be provided per person during the meeting. In order to provide verbal public comment, you must call in. Please call the following number and input the access code when prompted: 1-872-240-3311. The access code is 699-839-229. Once you've joined, you'll be placed on mute, and I will go ahead and unmute you when it's your turn to comment. So I'll go ahead and go to our first caller. Please begin by stating your name and your address for the record.
Hi, this is Michael Barber Gelada again, and my address is 2830 245th Place. That's in Sammamish, right behind Beaver Lake Park. And my public comment is, I really enjoyed this meeting and I learned a lot. But one of my questions is, when we're talking about the R housing and everything, you show me the setbacks and this, that, and everything. And I always see pictures of trees in the back and stuff. And as a homeowner when I moved over here from West Seattle, I chose to not go into new development because I wanted to have space for my daughter. So I bought a half-an-acre lot that has around 20 plus trees on it, majority of which have been topped, and they have rotting parts and they're horrid. And I've had arborists come over and they've all told me the same thing. And they've told me that, yeah, they're ugly, yeah, they're unhealthy, but according to Sammamish, they're going to want me just to cut off the bad part and let it stay, not caring about how it looks. And they said my best bet is to take a bundle of 5 trees a year, submit a permit, and then, maybe after 4 or 5 years, I can have my property looking good with replanting, trees that we want that'll be healthy. So my question is, when we're going over all these housing plans, is there a plan I can look at that says, hey, I'm at this acreage, I need to have this many trees? Or when you're building new houses, because if I look at when I moved in, Sunny Hills had just an open lot by it. And now if you go across from Sunny Hills, you have these, 4,000 square foot houses, for 1.5 million with no trees. So I'm just trying to understand how we're enforcing having a canopy when I see all the new developments with no trees or limited trees. And I have an old development which has, topped rotting trees that I can't get rid of. So that's kind of my public comment.
Chair Baughman, if I could respond to that, I'd be happy to. This is David Pyle, Director of Community Development for the city. You can find the rules you're asking about in the city's municipal code, SMC section 21A.37, regarding tree protection and preservation. You're right that there are different generations of tree rules in the city, and that is particularly complex due to state subdivision laws and vesting, grandfathering. 15 years ago are quite a bit different than they are now. However, under state law, a subdivision can last for up to 13 or 14 years under RCW 5817. So the issue there is that although we have new rules in place, not only regarding trees, but regarding other aspects of development, you're still seeing many of those projects being built or recently being built that reflect the older rule sets that we have. That's one part to my answer. The second part to my answer is that if the trees are in fact unhealthy, we only regulate healthy significant trees. We don't actually regulate unhealthy trees. And I'd be happy to put you in touch with the staff that are responsible for that program. If you want to email me and you have a pen, you can write down my email address and send me an email after this meeting. I'd be happy to put you in touch with them. My email is pretty simple. It's my name is David Pyle. P-Y-L-E is my last name. It's D-P-Y-L-E dpyle@sammamish.us. If you want to go ahead and send me, yeah, dpyle@sammamish.us, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with the staff who run that program. They've got a lot of good information for you to help you through that.
Will that be Justin?
That it would be Justin is one of our permit technicians. The people who really actually are running the program would be Jasveer Singh, or
I talked to him too. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, I appreciate the information. It's just that I've had a bunch of arborists, and the answer that I pretty much got was if they're not dead, they're not considered unhealthy. And I've had 3 arborists tell me that, and that's where I kind of got frustrated. They said, yeah, they're unhealthy, but in the past, they've always told me to just cut off the unhealthy part and let the tree grow. So, but
Okay.
I will email you afterwards.
Thanks for your comments. We need to move on. Jackie,
Right.
can we get to our next public comment, please?
Hi, this is Mary Wichter again. I live at 408 208th Avenue Northeast in Sammamish, Washington. I just wanted to say, wow, I actually had read the 13 pages and was wondering how the meeting would go, and it was just really wonderful to have it supplemented by the presentations that Jeff and that Leslie had gone on, and then having David Pyle speak to things. Also, I want to compliment the planning commissioners on really excellent questions, good concepts, thinking, and giving your input. So really, really appreciate that. I think the more that we do at the beginning, the better end is for everybody, and everybody learns at the same time. Just wanted to say a couple things. On the surveys, I believe in the past, Angie Fesser from Parks with Anjali Meyer, they had actually done some statistically valid surveys for some of the things that they had done, and there was not a large number of people. It was like 200, 300, 400, I don't even think it was 500. So just because there's a small number of people doesn't mean that the survey isn't worthwhile or reflective, but it is hard to let people know about that. So you might look back to see what Parks did on statistically valid surveys, just to give credit to what results you got from the survey here. I did like a lot of the discussions, particularly on what people are doing edges and how to blend the edges. I was really shocked by the diagrams that Jeff and Leslie had done, showing that the houses really are, like, the lot coverage just isn't enough of a requirement because they're not counting the streets and the full impervious. I think that answers a lot why we end up with really, really huge houses in Sammamish. I also liked the fact that you're talking about if you have a smaller lot, then you should have a smaller home. And if you get a bigger lot, you should have a bigger home. You shouldn't be able to put those really giant homes on small lots, because that is happening, and it's happening in critical areas, and that's particularly hard to do. I do wanted to respond to Mark Boffman, chairman, comment on septics. People that are in septics, they don't have a lot of choices. Sewer is not nearby. It's very expensive if you have to extend a sewer a long way. But sewers are expensive, but septics and fixing old ones are sometimes impossible, or it's very expensive, because if you just don't have the room, you can't do it. And if you're on steep slopes or other areas, it's hard. And then some of the newer septic systems, those are as expensive or even more expensive than a sewer can be. So I think we need to learn more about that. We do have Sammamish Plateau Water and King County Department of Health on the advisory committee for those types of discussions. So I look forward to that. And just in general, I didn't have a lot more to say, because I think what the consultant's doing and the input that they're getting from staff and everybody is fantastic. I've been devoting a large part of my volunteer time to giving feedback on things, mostly due to stormwater problems since about 2014, 2015. And I would say the process that's being used for the development regulations phase 2 is probably the best I've seen. I'm learning a lot. It really seems like you're listening. You guys have taken a ton of input, and you really look like you're going to be moving forward with changes that really will impact things. And then the only other thing I can say, that I didn't look it up, but when we were doing development phase 1 to phase 2, Mark Boffman had suggested some litmus tests that, if what we're doing, is it really, building something that makes a better character. And he had it really written well, and it's in the documents. But I think just knowing that we have some litmus tests, I think maybe those could be incorporated into what Jeff presents, because what we're looking to do is make changes that as they get put together individually in groups or together, that they overall end up with a better character, better neighborhood, easier system, non-stalled results, people that know more what to do, and more predictability within the city with more flexibility and different housing options. So just want to thank you all for the time and the great work here, and I really appreciated having the opportunity to listen in this call and also be able to speak.
Thanks for your comments, Mary.
Thank
Jackie,
you,
is that
Mary.
it?
We do have one more caller. I'll go ahead and unmute you. Go ahead and state your name and address for the record.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. Paul Stickney here, 22626 Northeast Inglewood Hill Road. I'd like to start with a little ad lib of giving a compliment to Mary and her last comment, because I echo a lot of what she said, and she took about 1 or 2 minutes off of my comment, so you won't have to hear it over again. And I also agree that I recall that Commissioner Mark Bachman did have a list of character-based things for neighborhoods during the first, development phase. It may be good to relook at that to see if any of those apply here. All right, now into my comment. First, I do agree with Tree Farm. It is zoned R1, and it is a wonderful cluster subdivision. I don't know the exact percentage, but I would guess that roughly the lots are clustered onto about a third of the site and 2/3 open. And many people really love that feel and the neighborhood. Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about what happened tonight on the Sammamish vision statement that you saw at the start of your meeting. There was a phrase there about meeting housing affordability through balanced, sustainable housing. And the current comp plan interwove sustainability and health factors through every element of the comp plan, and that was outlined in the introduction. But the sustainability in that statement meant something else. It meant what it was tied to for housing affordability through balanced sustainable housing. How do I know? I wrote it. It was one of several changes, and Commissioner Crandall can actually attest to this, that I got into the comp plan, and that is language I submitted for getting housing supplies to meet what people need and want over time, which many of you know my cause is about alleviating housing imbalance in Sammamish through optimized land use by enrich and sustain. A couple interesting points on scope and scale, and I appreciate Commissioner Bachman's comments about not being quite so strict on single lots, making sure people can add. But here's a little bit of interesting information, and this comes from a chart in the 2015 comp plan. On zone land in Sammamish, R1 is about 2,500 acres, and all these are rounded to the nearest 100 acres. R4 is about 6,400 acres. R6 is about 2,200 acres. And these three combine to just over 11,000 acres, or about 94% of the zone lands in Sammamish. R8 is roughly 90, R12, 57, and R18 about 140 acres. So they combine to about 300 acres, or 2.5% of the land area. What your charge is in the development regs 2 is covering about 96.5% of the zoned land in Sammamish, and the town center and the other three existing centers in the city make up the remainder, which is not a part of the charge that you're looking at here. My statement is, in my opinion, offering a suggestion, is to focus far more efforts on the R1, R4, and R6, not just because they make up a far larger percentage of the land, but there's a lot more opportunity for, development and redevelopment on those zones than on the other zones. I agree that phase 2 is character-based and cutting to the chase, in my opinion, I'll circle that IMO in great big letters. I think that the net effect of this will be to approximately move new and redevelopment back to about 2.5 to 3 homes per acre. That's what happened in Sammamish before 1990 on average. A lot of people like that. That would be true for most areas except for R1, which would have lower use. I've sent a lot of comments in recently over the last couple months and the year, and we'll only make a couple statements and then we'll close. The question is, let's go back to the Sammamish vision statement. What is the right amount and type of housing to round out housing supplies for those that live here now and want to change over time, and those who work here who cannot buy? What's the right mix of, in your charge that you're looking at, the 96.5% of the land, what's the right amount that goes there? And then not for you, but for City Council, what's the right amount that goes into our centers to come up with sort of a new vision statement? Commissioner Crandall added seniors to the vision. I'd like to change the Sammamish vision statement again, and that we look for balanced, sustainable housing with character and holistic enrichments for the entire community. That's my public comment tonight. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Mr. Stickney. That was our last caller. I'll hand it back to Chair Boffman.
When you get it back to Chair Bachman, I move that we extend the, I didn't want to interrupt Mr. Stickney, but move to go to what, 11:30? Is there a second for like the 10 minutes from now?
I'll second that. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. Okay.
I think what, again, I wanted to clarify something. Mr. Stickney mentioned my being there when he penned something. I believe I was the only member of this sitting body that was present when he did that. So that's my clarification.
We all look at you in reverence, Larry. Okay, we are at the end of our agenda. The one thing I'll just remind everybody of is our last meeting of the year is December 17th. And that should be it for 2020. And I look forward to leaving 2020 behind us and having 2021 be a much more exciting year, that sometime during which we're gonna get to see each other face to face. All right. Mr. Pyle, Ms. Hildy, anything else that we need to talk about this evening?
Nope. I will see you guys on the 17th.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All right, it's been moved and seconded to adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. We are officially adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, everyone.
You as well.